France and Brazil, but you looked, in the US, it was a tiny little sliver, and you could say, and I remember there's a guy who was pitching him to me, whose name was Phil Clymer. And I said, Phil, I can't give you cash, but I can give you some cachet. It was brilliant. Anyway, now Penguin has Seminole. Kingsley Amis, I have to say, Kingsley is an up-and-down writer, and I might have wished to publish fewer Kingsley Amises than we finally did. But I actually think Lucky Jim is a sort of spectacularly, I think it's still a very funny book, and I do think there's something nihilistic about Kingsley Amis at his best. But in a way, I had to publish, to get the ones I wanted to publish, I did have to publish some of the ones I didn't want so much.
So there's a payoff, or a compromise. Stoner, I guess, is that the one that's the...
Stoner is a kind of interesting history. One of the things that, for a long time when we were doing reissues, we got, and I'm sure we're to blame, we must have reintroduced this word ourselves at some point, described as a publisher who rediscovered authors. And of course, it's absurd to describe us as rediscovering somebody like Raymond Queneau, who's a major writer in the French, or Alberto Moravia, and so on. I mean, these are, or Seminole for that matter. But there is an element of rediscovery when it comes to work in English, especially American novelists, because frankly, any American novelist who had American literature isn't all that old, and anybody who had a substantial or influential career is likely to remain in print because of the national literature will just make it available. Maybe not in a widely disseminated edition, but when you look at certain 19th century regionalists, but probably available somewhere. The novelists who aren't are novelists who did things like publish one really good book and then take to the bottle. Because frankly, as a novelist, you don't exist unless you keep reminding people that you exist. And there are exceptions like Ralph Ellison, but I mean, this was an astonishing single novel, and then he did a lot of making people wait for the next one, even though it never really came. But Stoner is an example of that John Williams didn't really come from he came from a very, very poor background in Oklahoma, went to the Army, wrote one novel which we're about to reprint, which he wished that nobody would ever reprint, and I feel a little bit bad reprinting it, in fact, because it's not very good. But it's interesting for the bad novel that an ultimately good novelist will write, and it's not too long either. And it's one of those novels where, the gun goes off in the third act in a big, big, big way. So it's in its way sort of melodramatic fun. But Stoner, he then wrote three novels that each is in a different genre. Each was came out about a decade later than the previous one. And this is a really disastrous way to conduct a literary career. And none of them in the day actually got that much reception. So yeah, a bookseller told us about Stoner, and which actually was in print in England at that point. I think at the instance of the fine Irish short story writer John McGairn, who had been a real champion of the book and had gone to Vintage, and I think maybe almost along with having his own book by Vintage, had said, let me do an introduction to this book, put this book back in print. But it hadn't done much of anything. It hadn't done anything in England. It's a strange, the fortune of that book, which has sold well for us, but has sold over 5 or 6 million copies now in the world at large, and has been published successfully in China, in Israel, in France, in Italy, it's a very peculiar story how coming out of an essentially forgotten American writer can suddenly become, well, now the Library of America is going to do the three major novels in addition and become a world bestseller. And I don't know, obviously at a certain point, best-selling feeds on itself, having sold very well somewhere, somebody else will take it up and promote it. I wonder whether this novel, which is about it's basically, it's a very hard book to pitch. It's about a middle-aged, mid-20th century, Midwestern medievalist whose life is a complete failure. And it is not an obvious formula for a widely successful book. I think part of the appeal, at least in Europe to begin with, is it has a certain bit, it's a bit of like an Edward Hopper painting. It has a kind of long-shadowed American loneliness. And it is, in its own way, an existential novel. There is a way in which Stoner is another avatar of the stranger. So I think those things are something of what's buoyed it in its now world renown.
Okay, just before we come to it, we've still got time here. Last year you had your milestone 500th book issued. And the book was a German book called Sand by Wolfgang Herrndorf. So this book isn't that old and originally published in 2011. So I wondered how, was it just the one to cross the line at the right time?
That's it.
Or
It just
there
stumbled
was
over it just stumbled over
no
it.
particular reason why that was chosen?
Probably because other books were were delayed by issues of translating them and what you will, and But I wasn't unhappy that that a book that was a new translation, because it has been important to me in recent years to get people to recognize that we do, we bring books into the language that have not come into the language before, that are new to readers in the language. And I also, it pleased me that it be a fairly recent book, even though Herrndorf, in one sense, not all the writers we've published have been dead, but the vast majority of them are. And he had died, sadly, at quite a young age of a very, very aggressive cancer. So he fulfilled that, non-requirement. It's also a very, very strange, it is also a really brilliant variation on the thriller genre, and a certain kind of political novel. It's set in '71 after the Munich massacre. It is a book with a solution, but so complicated to figure out that if you blink, you miss it. But so anyway, it was just, I was happy that it should be that, and that it be a new translation and an author who was essentially pretty much new to the language too.
Yeah, good timing. One of the beauties of publishing the way that you do is it does give you this freedom to cover so many different genres: fiction, nonfiction, essays, notebooks, the noir, the science fiction, all these areas that you have, so that there's no one type of book that is an NYRB classic. But I can't leave this without talking about the huge publication last year of Anniversaries, Uwe Johnson. But I wanted to frame that against, which also to me was a large doorstopper, and that being Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. So you go from a book that was published in 1621 to a book that was written 350 years later. So Burton's 1,400 pages, and the other one is 1,700 pages, and both to me are significant undertakings that for a publisher of probably often associated with literary fiction to undertake. What kind of confidence do you have, or recklessness do you have to undertake those?
Burton was a book we published pretty early on in the series, and And there was certainly somebody in the office who was very opposed to it at that point. And I took a vacation in Paris, and a new translation of it had just come out in French, and I thought, for Christ's sake, if the French can publish a new translation of a piece of a great English book, albeit written in Jacobean English, surely we can just do a reprint, an off-print of the language of the book in English. So I came back from that vacation pretty much determined to do it. And we did it, and frankly, the book did very, very well. I think Penguin is finally getting around to doing its own edition. It's an editorial nightmare. I mean, it went through umpteen different editions, so anybody doing a new edition has to sit and think, well, I mean, Oxford is slowly but surely doing an edited version of it, but it's taken at least 50 years at this point, and it's still, I don't know where it is, but it's not done. So it's comparable to another big undertaking that we did, which was, this was an abridgment, but a very sizable abridgment. One of the books I'm most proud of in the series of Thoreau's 7,000-page diaries, but it was an abridgment that found a way to not just pull out the little nuggets of wisdom, which isn't really what Thoreau's about anyway, but to get the sort of dailiness of the book and the way in which it engages on a daily basis life, well, nature really. This distilled that, and it was a fairly big book too, 700 pages. There is a way if you just, I don't know, big books that you are sure will never work, often work. And I mean, like was the wonderful essays of Pierre Leis, Simon Leis, well, I mean, he's Belgian, but he lived in Australia, who wrote about sinologists. He wrote about everything that interested him. This book came in from its Australian publisher, big 500-page hardcover, and I had always read his essays with interest, but I thought, no, it's just, I mean, before even opening it, I thought, well, of course, I'll read some of the book because he's really interesting, but of course we're not going to publish this book because it's 500 pages of essays. It's by somebody who's completely unknown in the United States. And I started reading it, and they were just, he was too good. There was no way we couldn't publish this book. In fact, we made it bigger. We added some extra essays to it. And it sold, to my amazement. And so there was a way I wanted to, the Uwe Janssen book is an extraordinary novel, an extraordinary reimagining of what a novel can be, a political novel, which is something that interests me consistently, a novel about history and politics. I mean, that is a kind of core novel that we do, and it's probably core to the novels that I am the editor for in the series. It's a novel about New York. When it was published in a heavily abridged version ages ago, a decision was to remove all the sections about New York because Americans wouldn't be interested in finding out about what foreigners thought about New York. Well, they are we're all prickly about what other people think about us, but we're vain enough usually to be more interested in that than other things too. But, and I did have some hope that people, that publishing people would that our publishing it would make people take it seriously, and they wouldn't just walk by it saying, God forbid, a 2-volume, 1,700-page novel. And it seems to have worked out.
Mm-hmm. You changed the design for that, though.
We did, for two, we'd never done a box set before. Mm-hmm. A box set is an expensive proposition. Our design, there's nothing about our design that actually is designed to be on a box set. It's also oversized, and it is a characteristic of the design that it doesn't scale up. If you do it, if the books get bigger, that block loses its relationship to the outer edge of the thing, and it just looks like a gravestone.
Right. Right. I do also want to touch with the engagement with readers.
Uh-huh.
And I believe that this is really a critically important part of independent publishing and publishers who are trying to reach an audience that might be widely spread. And NYRB Classics now has quite an active and engaged Twitter feed and engaging regularly with readers. And I think readers appreciate that. I think, especially with a publisher like this or a publisher like Seagull, there's a sense of attachment to the publishers, and you have the book club subscription series. There are book clubs on Goodreads and things, reading NYRB classics. Somebody specifically asked me, on the website there's a spot in the corner that says, is there a book that you'd like to see come to print? And this person told me to ask you, do you ever take readers' suggestions?
Of course.
And if so, is their name ever recognized? Is there a prize?
Well, we always have said that when we do it, we'll certainly send a copy of the book to the person who suggested it. There are cases where that gets touchy because, well, we will have had the book suggested many times over the years, and before we do it, and we lose track sometimes. We don't have a foolproof filing system for who suggested it, but there are people who've written in after that and said, I suggested that book, and obviously we will also send the book then to who, even if there were others who did it. But no, that's a very interesting, I look at those quite carefully, and also people often ask, say, suggest books we've already signed up, or suggest books that other publishers I know have signed up and have coming out, and I'll write back to say, this book is coming out with this other publisher, or we will be publishing this book at some point in the future. And recently I discovered a really interesting novel from the early 70s by a woman named Susan Taubes that somebody wrote in about. And I had never heard of Susan Taubes, but I recognized the name Taubes as the name of a relatively little-known historian of religion, and I wondered whether there was a relation, and there was. And I read the novel, which was published by Knopf in the early 70s, and nobody paid any attention to it. And the woman, it's a bit of a suicide note, sadly, this novel, but there was one unbelievably condescending look at what lady novelists can do review in the New York Times Book Review, which actually I think might be a selling point at this point. It's but I ended up acquiring that, tracking down her children and acquiring that book. So yeah, we take that seriously. The other stuff I can't lay any credit. I can't claim any credit for the Twitter. So my colleague Sarah Kramer, who I've worked with from the very beginning, handles all of that stuff and handles it really, I think, very well. But it is an important thing. We do book groups with, she does book groups with local bookstores in New York, and we do try and respond to readers and readers groups, and I think it has become an important way of introducing a good book. And after all, publishing is finally about finding a book the public that you think it deserves, and there's no point in publishing a book without doing your best to find that public for it.
That discussion is so critical, I think. So I wanted to open it up to questions. So if anybody here has a question for Edwin. We have a mic. Do we have a? Yeah, microphone's coming.
You have wrote so many books. According to your opinion, which is in all of your books, which is your favorite? You think?
My favorite.
Which attracts the public readers most?
Oh, which has affected readers most? Did I get the question correct? Which book has found readers most?
And you think also that all of in your books, that is the favorite.
That's your favorite?
In the reader's eye and also in your eye. Which is favorite?
What's your favorite? Yeah.
My favorite?
Yeah.
Well, of course, I shouldn't say that because then, because I'm supposed to love them all, right?
All your children.
But I don't like any of the books my colleagues buy. No, but there are a lot of, since they are books of different kinds, there are books that I like for various different reasons. But Among them, the Thoreau book I mentioned is a book that means a great deal to me. It was a treat to republish Sir Thomas Browne, who I think is a really wonderful writer. I often think of, this is actually, one of my, for me, a real discovery of the series was the Chinese writer Eileen Chang. And I often say that from my sense of having discovered something that I really knew nothing of, though some of her books actually were already available in English, her collection of novellas and short stories that we published with the title Love in a Fallen City introduced a writer who I think is a really world-class writer to me, and whom I just had no suspicion of before stumbling on her in a footnote in a reference book.
Or detective work to find something interesting. Is that a method you like to follow?
There's a lot of serendipity. I mean, whether with readers writing in, I'm suddenly reminded, since we're in India, that another writer I discovered that I certainly, who's very much one of our living writers, but is Upamanya Chatterjee, whose English August we published for the first time in America. And that came to me because Akhil Sharma wrote me a very irritable note by email. He said, you are said to discover books that nobody's heard of, but if you were serious, you would be interested in Upamanya Chatterjee's work. So I wrote back to Akhil, whom I didn't know at all at that point, and said, I don't know this work, could you please tell me more about it? And so he's always said, I was rather abashed. I wanted to say, you know, obviously you're not somebody who actually takes any interest in anything. So, you know, that was serendipitous, and it was, I suppose, you know, fun. But, yeah, there's a fair amount of serendipity, and there are also books. And perhaps the weirdest book I ever published is a book by a woman named Maud Hutchins, who was married to the most famous, a famous president of the University of Chicago, and I think he's the only famous president of the University of Chicago, and with whom she had a very complicated relationship, and I think they finally broke up because she sent drawings, Christmas cards with little nude girls on them out in 1947, and this was not deemed. But she was clearly a very clever lady. But I discovered in a used bookstore this book called Victorine, and it didn't say anything about the author except that she liked to fly airplanes. And it had sort of pink prison stripes on the front. It was from a small publisher whose work I knew that had been active in the 50s and 60s, and it was a serious and interesting publisher. I started reading the book, and it's an extremely strange book, and I thought I discovered, and a little bit, kind of more Lolita than Lolita before Lolita, with a very elaborate style, and I thought, maybe this was a point when the notion of outsider art was quite popular. And I thought, maybe I've discovered a kind of outsider writer who's crazy, but sort of like nobody else. She wasn't really that much of an outsider, though she was pretty crazy. I don't know. She was dead, yeah. But I mean, it was weird enough that I thought there's nothing like it, which I think is not